So, welcome in the Voice from Heaven. Welcome in this 3 Days to Awakening episodes or series. And welcome, of course, in that remembrance of who we are in our coming together and expressing our willingness to have God being the light in which we see, have God being the mind with which we think, have God being the source from which we cannot see apart, and knowing that God goes with us wherever we go. And those are just a few examples of those lessons that we share in this sequence of the lessons 41 to 50, which are very essential in our alignment with the perspective. I'm not this. I'm not a body, and I'm not a personality, and I'm not this small idea of limited self. And though I'm just gonna make it pretty quick today, and it will be just a short intercession because I'm also active in a German congress, online congress, and that is the reason why we started a little bit earlier today. But using this idea of day 1, day 2, and day 3, of course, our recognition, our transformative willingness to experience ourselves in a complete honesty of what transformation of mind, transformation of self includes. And those are the descriptions of day 1 and day 2, will automatically and very, very naturally and miraculously open up to that revelatory recognition of who I am in truth. And of course, that is an experience, that is an eternal thought that doesn't exclude anybody or anything, that doesn't limit ourselves in another concept, in a spiritual or in an enlightened being concept, but is a very simple recognition of not being a body, of not being this and that, of not being part of this dream sequence of suffering, death, loss, aging, sickness. All we know it. And those are first the recognitions in this arriving here, in this maybe being for a moment in a shock situation and acknowledging and admitting, oh my God, I'm here really in a dream. I'm here in a nightmare. I have entered here in this so-called human conceptual form, physical form association in a human life of a time span of around 80 to 100 years, right? Or maybe less or maybe more, but experiencing that sense of separation in a very personal experience, devastating experience of the pain and suffering of being, of imagining to be separate from my source, who is God. God is my source, and therefore I cannot only see apart from him, I cannot think apart of him, I cannot be a part of him. And that is that realization will automatically lead to a request in our mind to be shown, to be guided, to be taught, so that there is a learning possible, so that there is a recognition possible. Okay, none of this that I see with my body's eyes, that is part of sensual perception, none of my perceptions and the meanings of those perceptions are real. I am not this, because those were the reflections in the mirror, reflecting the death idea, the false identity, the false ego I self. But realizing that all human actions in one or the other way, in all ways, will always lead to death and to that annihilation of that self as I was making myself and holding myself, which is a limited self idea, which is an idea of personality, which is an idea what I would do in a body as a body or not do in a body or as a body. That little self, we realize it becomes revealed to us, is not what we are. But we're talking here about experiences on this day one, where we first admit and see those limitations, right? We see this indoctrinated self-identity in everywhere, right? And also find, of course, out that there is no real solution within the concept. There is no real solution here. Though, of course, we have looked for it endlessly in all corners of our mind. We have tried everything and on all levels in any way, and utilizing all kind of possible accumulated knowledge from the past, or give me the smart ones and I'm going to study them, and I will accumulate that under quote knowledge, because that's not really what knowledge is. So all part of education, all parts of that assimilation of, I call it, mental capacity that make up that conceptual self, that I, that me, that sense of limitation. And to realize that there must be something beyond that. There must be more to me. There must be more to my purpose of being here, of coming here. And that leads us automatically to this second step, this second action of mind, this day two, in which we do fully realize that this is all about, that self is all about a limited self that is surrounded and surrounds itself by limitations. And it is just moving forward or coming to a resolution by coming to a new decision, by it must be a decision that I do have really enough of experiencing myself in that form or all forms of limitation, which means I do have enough of experiencing myself in everything that determines time, space, this place I call location or the world, right? Because I do realize that everything has its same base, and that base is fear within, as an expression of self, of that limitation. And so that dream of fear that is maybe in small steps finally realized as a dream of separation is asked for a unifying mind system. The individuum I'm asking for what shows me and is revealing itself in me as one, as a oneness beyond that appearances and perception of separation. So there is no solution within the split mind, or the mind that thinks and perceives itself in separation, but the solution is the recognition and experience of oneness. And this is where we go along in our mind training. I'm using here and teaching actively A Course in Miracles. And this is a message from Jesus Christ, from your own, my own Christ mind, from out of time, showing us the way where we can walk together in an experience that will undo all our beliefs and we will inevitably arrive at something that the eyes cannot see anymore, something that is no longer part of sensory perception, something that we call oneness, but isn't really a concept of oneness. It is being one, is, is an undescribable experience, is an unexplainable experience, is something that never changes. It is unchanging, unchangeable, and unchanged, and is the demonstration that there is another way of seeing the world, seeing myself, seeing everyone in my dream in a completely new and different way. And this has been called for a long time rebirth, but that rebirth is supposed to be understood as a new birth. And as Jesus told Nicodemus, in order to realize who he is, he has to be reborn, as it was translated, is really the indication of coming to that new experience, to a new birth within one's own self-recognition. And that new birth is our awakening recognition, is our awakening experience, is our experience of knowingness, of knowing who we are, who I am, speaking for myself, and knowing that that knowingness is no longer part of that dream sequence, of that cycle of misery, sickness, and death, in which everything gets lost. Get ready for that. Everything that you capture in your perception, everything that you made an object of perception, is getting to be lost, because it is only a representation of your limited thought forms, your limited thinking within that limited self. And therefore, it doesn't really have a true connection to source. It doesn't really have any universal substance in it of which it could prove its universality or its eternal nature. And therefore, it is prone to disappear, to be undone, to disappear in the nothingness in which it was made up and came from. And this is how we made the world we see. And this has nothing whatsoever to do with God. God did not create these limitations. God did not create an objective world. God did not create bodies as objective figures in that representation of mind in separation. So I'm definitely making here a stand of this complete necessary action of mind, of turning to that source out of time, that higher self, and asking from the depths of our soul, help, show me who I truly am. Undo my thoughts, help me so that I can learn to see everything with your light, the light of God, in which we can see who we truly are, what the entire universe is, because it is not this what we see with our eyes. It is not this that we think with our conceptual mind and study all along over lifetimes and lifetimes. We are arriving, we are acknowledging an universal corrective principle that has its basis and its source in a higher power that I personally, I'm not shy to call it God or the Holy Spirit. Who cares? Okay. But it is greater than my own self-fabricated dream images and way of conceptual thinking, of seeing things in categories and in cause and effect being separated. Cause and effect is in truth one. And this is what we have to come to know by that help, by accepting that help that is given us from out of time, from our whole mind, from universal mind. This is really the penetration of the denial. you could call it entering into a black hole and coming out on the other side, knowing perfectly well that nothing has ever happened here in time space, that nothing is being done by bodies or limited self, but everything is present forever and forever, for all time, which is in truth timelessness, timeless self. And so we have to understand, and going back to our day one action, our first action in the transformation, we have to understand how our perception operates in our mind, what havoc it is done in our mind by believing and giving meaning to perception and perceptual objects. And so if I'm sharing here my manuscript to a book being published, yes, we already have the basis as the call to the unlimited that you can also, is available on Amazon.com. The author you find as Devavan. And that basis describes those actions all together, but there will come new publications which will describe in detail those three actions, those ideas of 3 days, of coming here, of making a new decision and expressing the necessity for that transformative experience, for that revelatory experience, and being in that experience, literally going home, leaving this time-space perceptual continuum altogether. And so I'm sharing here ideas from this manuscript, which are still unpublished. But I will let you know when the next part is being published. For now, you can dive into this basic work that has been called the call to the unlimited. And yes, I have a copy here to show it to you how it looks like. As the book, here it is, Call to the Unlimited. And it is, yes, those are, this is for the salvation of the world, because it is for the salvation of myself. And so in this new description of where I'm coming from and where it is going along, and how I'm willing to experience myself in the undoing of all limited thought forms. So we were leaving it the last time that it is only by an honest expression, honestly expressing our feelings, and by having the willingness to experience them entirely into their source where they are coming from, their origin, right? We are coming to, I came to know that the experiencer, that the me as the experiencer can be left without illusion. So in that investigation into that self, into putting all the concepts on the table and asking for the undoing, in having a last look at it and realizing its limitations, as we were mentioning it, realizing that there is no solution in any of them, we are going beyond the identity of an experiencer who keeps concepts, illusions about his experience. And of course, as you already see and can hear, this goes beyond the spiritual concept of awakening or an identity, a spiritual identity. Because once the experiencer is gone, that I is gone, there is no object of experience to be described. You are simply that you always have been and always will be, healed, complete, and whole, as God created you. And so in this last step of those actions, finally all illusions are removed. And I will add on, are removed for me, right? It is not a doing on my part. I'm just being willing for the undoing and be willing to unravel everything and put it literally on the altar for the undoing. The undoing is what that higher consciousness, that what I call the Holy Spirit, is facilitating to me, to you, to all of us. So this step doesn't need our participation, right? It is an undoing process. That is how Jesus expresses it in the Course in Miracles. All it takes is willingness, and only willingness. My willingness to not resist that undoing, my willingness to step beyond fear thoughts and limited thought forms of separation, of that feeling of being in or as a body, that willingness is necessary and is required. But it is accomplished literally by that universal energy we call God, by God Himself, and reveals the one and only reality of which we are speaking, in which we recognize who we are. Now I'm gonna go and will share with you, because this is really about this undoing process of this removal of illusions, as we called it, and we'll go to the course itself and share with you something of the beginning chapters in chapter 4 in the second section. And I'm going to the second paragraph, and I'm using here the edition that has been published or non-published, which was is considered the urtext, which is basically very unedited or almost unedited version of how Jesus gave this message to the scribe Helen Schackman. Okay, this starts with: perceptual distortions are not abstractions. Perceptual distortions, distortions in the mind, are not abstractions. They are merely confusions. So now you know, whenever the mind is confused, when you meet anybody who expresses, I'm confused, or when you feel that you yourself are confused about who you are, what the truth about yourself is, your thoughts, your feelings, then know that though we are talking here actually about perceptual distortions, and each man makes one ego for himself, Jesus says, although it is subject to enormous variation because of its instability, and one for everyone he perceives. Okay, each man makes one ego for himself and one for everyone he perceives. See, those are made up ideas. He uses the word fabrication or making it up. Yeah. So one ego for oneself, one ego for everyone else who is perceived, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process which literally alters both, because they were not made either by or with the unalterable. It is particularly important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind. The interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical presence. So, in both, though everything, including the physical presence, is in the mind. Thinking about another ego. Okay, now we are going on the level of thinking. Very important, because everything is realized, and also so the healing and the undoing and the correction is done on the level of thinking. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is their physical interaction. Once again, thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is their physical interaction, right? It doesn't change anything. There could be no better example of the fact that the ego is an idea, though not a reality-based thought. The ego is an idea. It's simply an idea in the mind. You believing you're something else than pure perfection and wholeness is already a limited idea. And the ego as an idea is not a reality based thought. A reality based thought is a thought of God, is a thought of love, of wholeness, of happiness, of joy, of unlimited experience and sharing. Now, maybe we want to look here further on about the idea of consciousness, and that is in chapter 3 in section 4, and I will touch excerpts from paragraph 2 and 3. Consciousness, we are conscious, everyone is conscious, but consciousness is part of the ego mind, is part of the limitation. And so Jesus expresses that in the Course. As in the Eastern philosophy, consciousness, but capitalized, is considered as God. Jesus defines it and describes it, is still part of the ego's realm. Here he says first, consciousness is thus the level of perception, but not of knowledge. And that already expresses that as that it is not really of God. The conscious mind, to be conscious about thinking, about experience, about perceiving, is on the level of perception, not of knowledge. Again, to perceive is not to know. To perceive is not to know. To perceive is not to know. Consciousness was the first split. He calls it a split, what I was describing as the separation thought. The first split that man introduced into himself. That was consciousness. Consciousness is also aware of oneself. But that awareness of oneself is already an idea of oneself, and therefore different than what God's self, what whole creative self is in being that. So consciousness was the first split that man introduced into himself. He became a perceiver rather than a creator in the true sense. So perceiver is the I is perceiving something, an object of perception, an object of oneself, an object of the you, of a world, of somebody else who in truth isn't even here. What a revelation, isn't it? Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. Wonderful, right? This to understand, correctly identified as the domain of the ego. Carl Jung, right? Everybody knows Carl Jung in the last century, was right indeed in insisting that is part of the urtext, right? That's not in the edited version of the Kurzweil version. Jung was right indeed in insisting that the ego is not the self, insisted that the ego is not the self, and that the self should be regarded as an achievement. He did not recognize a term we now understand, that the achievement here capitalized, that the achievement was God's. And in a sense, the ego was a man made attempt to perceive himself as he wished rather than as he is. That's what we are, that's what I am, is what I described and was calling the beingness, right? And being everything or being you right now is really experiencing God, right? Again, in a sense, the ego was a man made attempt to perceive himself as he wished rather than as he is. And that wishing was just fabricating, making up more limited ideas. That it shows up then as a world of billions and trillions of facets and different form associations, figures, and everything in it, right? So that is then the wish rather to perceive than to be. Once we decide, we reverse that, we turn that around. being becomes the undoing of all perception, the undoing of the self-concept. So this is an example of the creator confusion, Jesus calls it. We spoke of before. He can only know himself as he is. Knowing is being, right? Isness. He can only know himself as he is because that is all he can be sure of. Everything else is open to question. And because everything else is open to question, everything else is not true, is an illusion, or has nothing to do with reality. It is of our own making. It doesn't exist. That is the perfect definition that Jesus gives us in lesson 14 about the world we see. So the ego is the questioning compartment of the post-separation psyche which man created for himself. It is capable of asking valid questions, but not of perceiving wholly valid answer, because these are cognitive and cannot be perceived. The endless speculation about the meaning of mind has led to considerable confusions. Confusion because the mind is confused. That's what split mind. That the mind that keeps on wishing and making perceptual object is literally trapped into. So it is a trap when confusion shows up or when there's an identification with confusion. No, the truth is very clear, it's very simple, it's very obvious. Only to finish that up now, only one-mindedness, one mind, one-mindedness is without confusion. And a separate or divided mind must be confused. A separated or divided mind, a human consciousness, seeing a myriad of different realities or reflections of realities, must be confused. A divided mind is uncertain by definition. It has to be in conflict because it is out of accord with itself. And you see now, confusion leads to conflict. Conflict just confirms and nourishes again the separation, the separated self. Now you see why it is so important to first admit where we are coming from and to admit, oh, this is how I made myself. This is what I made myself. I made myself a split self, a split mind, a split thinker, in all those imaginations that we call in the course are given meaning. I've given everything I see the meaning that it has for me. And that was considered a safety. Now we are leaving that safety because we do no longer believe that that is keeping us safe. And we turn to true source, to God, in order to find true safety. Nothing special about it, nothing difficult about it, but it is the only deal there is, right? Unless we turn to the higher power, to our true source, in order to ask for true safety, it will always show up just as a limited form of safety that will be threatened and attacked and turned over, and sickness, death, and loss. That's all what the human condition is about. So I'm going to leave it with that for today. As I said already in the beginning, we started out here earlier because of the ongoing Congress in German language. I'm very grateful that you're present, that you're here for me and with me for a moment, and you join with me in this absolute recognition of the truth of who we are as God created us, and the willingness to have everything else being undone. I love you with all my heart. Here is just last sounds of this song, and with that we're gonna go out from here. Thank you, brother. Thank you.